Why does God condone slavery? I'm sure many of you have asked that question. I have asked that question and struggled with it as someone of the African diaspora. And in my readings, I have come to the conclusion that God does not condone slavery. Now, the premise is this, and I need you all to stay with me. This is going to be a multi-part series, so don't worry, I'm not making a 10-minute video right now. God does not explicitly outlaw slavery, but he creates frameworks both in the Old and New Testament that are aimed at fixing the source of the problem, which is the heart of man itself. When a person's heart is mended to recognize the value of human life and its dignity, they will oppose slavery of their own volition, as opposed to simply following a rule. And I know logically that may make sense, but in your heart of hearts, you're still probably thinking, well, why couldn't God just make it one of the mitzvah, one of the rules? Why isn't it an explicit part of Torah or the law, the Mosaic law? And with that, I would remind you, as I had to remind myself, humans do not do well with spiritual law. Okay? There is no one who is good. Okay? We see all of the 613 mitzvah that were broken by the Israelites time and time again. We see what happened with the Gentiles, who, although they didn't have Mosaic law, we know from Mosaic law that they also broke these rules. And we know that even us, as children of God, through Christ Jesus himself, we still fall and stumble multiple times, sometimes in the same day. So creating a rule explicitly is not fixing the issue. The issue is the heart of man himself. Now, when we're looking at the Old Testament framework, long story short, Hebrew slaves had more protections than foreign-born slaves, but even the protections that were allotted to foreign-born slaves still left them better off than if they were a slave in other Near Eastern cultures. Some of the things that were done in Mosaic law were semi-revolutionary compared to how slavery was regulated in other Near Eastern cultures. All the cultures always tried to regulate slavery to reduce abuses and things of that nature at that point in time. But Israel is special because the basis of their regulations were theological. They were not just simply hierarchical or because the king said to do it. They were because these were stipulations brought from God himself. Now, in the next couple videos, we'll actually go through some of those verses and expound more on the framework. Shalom, people. So as I mentioned in the previous video, we're going to go through some of these Old Testament verses. And again, strap your seatbelts on. Some of these things are hard to swallow, but you're going to really see the dichotomy between these verses. Because some verses, I'm like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And then other verses, I'm like, why? All right, so we'll start in the foreign slave framework. So foreigners, both from the nations around Israel and also resident aliens, their people, their descendants could be purchased as slaves. Hebrews were not supposed to purchase each other as slaves, but for Hebrews, there was a lot of debt slavery where a brother would become so poor or indebted to somebody else that they sell themselves to their brother until that debt is paid, or they, become a slave for 6 years. They're freed on the 7th, or whenever that Jubilee year is. When it came to foreign-born slaves, as I mentioned previously, they could end up as slaves for life. But this was not a commandment. This was they can become permanent slaves. So at that point in time, you have to realize it's of the volition of the master themselves, whether they make that decision or not. Runaway slaves were not to be returned back to their master. Instead, they were given a place of their choosing to live in Israel. And specifically, God said that this person is not to be mistreated. Now, this is very interesting because in the Hammurabi Code, which was a code of ethics in Babylon, runaway slaves, or those who helped them, they were severely punished. So already you're seeing sort of a split between Israel and other Near Eastern cultures. Then you have slaves were allowed to rest on the Sabbath. God said everybody is resting on the Sabbath. And slaves could participate in parts of covenant life. So slaves could eventually become proselytes or converts to Judaism. So keep that in mind, because I'm going to bring that up later. Now, when you come to the protections of Hebrew-born slaves, again, there's a lot more protections. So again, as I mentioned, slavery with the Hebrews, it was for 6 years, and then they were set free on the 7th year. Slaves who already had wives, whenever that male slave was set free, the wife was set free with him. So that way, families were not broken apart. There was a nuance where if the slave was bought single and then the master provides a wife to the slave, if that slave then wants to go free, the woman and the children are still the master's. But if the slave then says, hey, I want to stay with my family, then he is allowed to stay with his family at that time. Again, that's one of those like weird, hard to swallow pills right there. A female slave who is given to the master's son shall be treated according to the custom of daughters. So if this wasn't, just, you're going to be with my son, abuse, all these things. No, you had to treat her like a daughter at that point, which is interesting. A female slave to a master who finds a wife, that master is not to have the female slave's food, clothing, nor conjugal rights reduced. And if the master disobeys this, he has to free that woman. So again, another pathway to freedom. And from what I could tell, it was hard to say whether this was specifically for Hebrews or just everyone in general. I interpret it as all slaves in general, but that is up for discussion. People who kidnap men, whether they sold them into slavery or not, receive the death penalty. So, and that's something that's in Exodus, and it's repeated in Deuteronomy. And specifically in Deuteronomy, after it says the evil must be purged from among you. So God did not respect kidnapping. So remember that we're getting pieces and nuances of the things that God considers proper, even though He is not completely getting rid of this system, but He is working inside the system, and that's why I kept saying it's a heart posture thing. Any mortal wound given to a slave. So if a master kills a slave, that master is punishable. You compare this with other slavery systems, especially like in the Greco-Roman world. Masters could abuse slaves, they could prostitute them, they could kill them, and they could do all of these things with little to no punishment. So that's another difference that we see here in the Old Testament framework. And then if masters harm the eye or the tooth, I don't know why it specifically says that, probably to be parallel with the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth thing. Essentially, if they give a permanent injury to a slave, they maim that slave is automatically set free. So you're starting to, again, see these differences. Everything is not clearly black and white. Everything is not rainbows or thunderclouds. It's like a mixture of both. And then one thing that is very interesting is runaway slaves. I already said that. But I had that in both areas because that applies to both Hebrew slaves and foreign-born slaves. And so now we have to try to understand, why is there a difference in the protections between Hebrew-born slaves and foreign-born slaves? And then I'll go over that in the next video, because I'm trying to make sure I don't make these too long for y'all. Shalom, people. Now we're going to try to see, why is there a difference in the treatment between foreign-born slaves and Hebrew slaves? So my theory is that it all goes back to the Tower of Babel and how God partitioned the nations according to the number of the sons of God and all of that. If you need to understand what I'm talking about, view my Conquest of Canaan video and the supplementary video that I posted after that. But with that context in mind, okay, we realize that God has disowned every other nation, but kept Israel for himself. And Israel didn't exist yet, but he was going to bring Israel into existence through Abraham and his descendants, through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. With this in mind, we get a hint at the difference in treatment and why it exists, actually from what God continues to remind the Israelites of throughout Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, which is, remember that y'all were slaves in Egypt. Remember, that you were a slave in Egypt. You will not lord yourself over your brother, because remember, you were a slave in Egypt. And then he specifically says in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 55, for the sons of Israel are my slaves. They are my slaves whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh your God. And that's essentially, that was in response to saying that, my people will not be slaves of any foreign people because they're my slaves. And so we see here that God is showing and reaffirming his ownership of Israel as a people. But he doesn't own foreign born people. He doesn't own the Canaanites or any of them yet. And we're going to understand this even better when we get to the New Testament. But he doesn't own them. They're owned by the principalities that they ended up following into darkness. That's who they're owned by. And therefore, they're not afforded the same protections as the Hebrew Israelites because God doesn't own them. Now, mind you, we know God owns everything. But in the framework of the Tower of Babel, the splitting of the nations, God is not their master. But that's also why I was saying, if they then convert and become a proselyte, from a heart standpoint, it would, to me, if I was an Israelite, be difficult for me to continue to keep somebody as a slave when now I see them as my brother, as opposed to, again, a war criminal or war captive from 20 years ago or something of that nature. So that is why I believe that there is this dichotomy of protections between foreign-born slaves and Hebrew slaves.